Think about the best compliment you've ever received. What did the person giving you that compliment recognize about you? Usually, if it's a really good compliment, it's not the most obvious thing about a person that we compliment. When we are showing that we understand and recognize someone, we're showing that we value something that they value about themselves. And that's what makes a good compliment really effective. So while it can be fine to say, hey, I really like your shoes. Hey, you've got a nice smile. Things like that are things that appear to everyone. And so could really be said about anyone. If you want to make someone feel like they're recognized and appreciated and understood, often we have to recognize something about them that is a little bit less obvious. Practicing praise or giving compliments is also a good way of thinking about how to avoid cliche. What's most offensive or disappointing about cliche is often not so much that it's just said a lot. A lot of things that are said often have some truth or some value to them. The problem with cliche is that it doesn't recognize the specificity of the situation that it's speaking about or the person that is being spoken to. You can go back to the old video on the rhetorical stance to think about the relationship between the speaker, the audience, and the thing that's being spoken about. One thing we can say here is that a cliche, while it might broadly touch on all three of those things, it is speaking to a generic audience about a generic topic, and that makes me, the speaker, appear very generic. So, what are some of the techniques we can use in order to make sure that we are giving good compliments? First of all, we can think about a compliment as a highly condensed form of a speech of praise. One of the things that makes a compliment maybe differ from a speech of praise is the audience. We give a compliment directly to the person that we're praising, whereas when we're giving someone a speech of praise, at an award ceremony, at a eulogy, at a wedding toast, we're often speaking indirectly to them or about them before an audience of people who may know them well or who may not know them at all. So the first thing you're thinking about when you're trying to praise someone is, who is my audience? If you're speaking directly to the person, what's most important is their understanding of their relationship to you. If they know you really well, you can have an intimate compliment that shows that you really understand them. If they're a new acquaintance, you might have to be more careful with that, because if you show that you know too much about them, that might make them unsettled and make them feel like, oh wow, I'm being very closely observed. So you have to be careful in that situation about how closely honed your compliment is to your audience. If you're giving a compliment or a speech of praise to a broader audience, you need to be considering a number of things. Who is in the audience and who is likely to know the person that I'm speaking about? And what's their understanding of that person? What's the person's reputation? How does that person come across? Is that person mostly well received, or are people here more in a kind of official capacity? So all of those things need to be understood by you as you are preparing to give praise. But what might be some of the things that we compliment someone about? As we talked about in the video on characterization, one of the things might be an unexpected combination of characteristics. Why is that going to be really good for a compliment? If you're giving it to an individual person, it's going to show that you're attentive to different aspects of them, to show that you understand them as an individual rather than as simply a type of person. And this can also be true when you're giving a speech before a broader audience. Who is this person? Especially if you're speaking to an audience that doesn't know the person, to show them how they were complex, how they had many characteristics that weren't just, again, a type of person. Another thing that you might talk about is, what does the person do quietly? So both when we're giving a compliment and we're giving a speech of praise before a number of people, we have to consider, what does that person think everyone knows about them, or alternately, how does everyone else perceive that person's reputation? People might have lots of private knowledge of that person, but when we're in an audience together, let's say at a wedding, people have a sense of, well, what's that person's general reputation? If you know the person casually, what do you know about them? So if somebody is giving a kind of speech of praise, they might talk about what we all know about that person. And since I'm giving the speech, what is it something that maybe people don't recognize about that person because they do it quietly? So if someone has a kind of reputation as a great partier, they're a lot of fun. If you say something like, "Oh wow, they really love to laugh," you don't really contribute much to the public celebration of this person, especially if you're in a position that's more intimate to them than the rest of the audience is. A better way to do it is to acknowledge that public reputation and say, "We all know that." But what you might not know is, in a time of my great grief, what a comfort Laura was to me. What a comfort Sam was to me. And talk about that and narrate that. Another thing we can do is take one of those things that everybody recognizes about the person, a praiseworthy quality, and make it more vivid through a story that gives it qualities that might make it more praiseworthy. So if we go back again to the idea of being a lot of fun at parties, well, fun can be kind of ambiguous, and there might be people in the audience who don't approve of the kind of fun that we're having, or maybe have different attitudes toward it. So if I want to acknowledge that, I can still maybe make it more praiseworthy for that broader audience, actually by making it more vivid. So I might say, it wasn't just about bringing everyone to the party. It wasn't just about having the most people there. It was about recognizing what everyone at that party needed in order to have a good time, and making people who wouldn't dance otherwise, knowing what those songs were, and maybe you'll talk about what those songs were, something like that. Of course, it would depend on the person. It has to be something that is genuinely about that person. Finally, and this one is a little bit risky, but can be very powerful in the right circumstance, is the virtue in their vice. Sometimes we do this at eulogies. When we're really close to someone and we're grieving them, we really want to honor their whole life. And no one, not a single one of us, is perfect, and we all have flaws. One of the things that we can do is to make it not feel like we're just kind of giving a false image of someone. We want to include things about them that aren't the things that you would typically praise about someone that you didn't know. But by bringing that closer to virtue and showing the relationship of saying that someone was so honest, maybe too honest sometimes, and you tell a funny story about how they said, "Oh, we brought your prom date over to your grandmother," and she said, "Oh, I liked the other one better." Okay, something like that everyone can laugh at. And then you follow it up and say, but let's look at another moment of where that honesty came about and how that honesty really was a virtue. So you show both sides of it, allowing the first one to be humorous and the next one to be sincere, intimate, even profound. What are some of the things that we should avoid in giving praise? We don't want to go with superlatives. This becomes very cliche and sometimes in bad taste. The greatest, the best, the most, anything like that, any kind of predicate that uses that kind of superlative is going to feel a little bit false. Unless, of course, you're praising Itzhak Perlman or something and saying he's the greatest violinist of all time. But if you're going to make an argument like that, it has to be, of course, appropriate for the context. And you need to show why. Why is that person so great in that area? Of course, another thing you should do is anything that someone has said or done in confidence, you don't want to, even if you're going to show a more intimate side of your relationship to that person, you have to consider whether they're present with you or if they have passed on or not present with you. Whether that person would want the detail that you're saying to be made publicly known. And if you're talking about a compliment that's given directly to the person, this still applies. Because if you're going to say something back to someone about what they said to you or did to you, and it was something that was kind of private, even though they know that you know it, they might not want it brought up again. So it's important to kind of consider, even if it's something that you value about the person or you think that what they did exemplified some virtue. Maybe they helped out someone in their family who's having a really hard time, but maybe they don't want to be reminded of that other person's hard time. So you need to kind of think about the impact that it might have to make that knowledge public or even in private to remind the person of that. And finally, you don't want to do anything that would sound euphemistic. This is a little bit of a strange one, but the idea is you don't want to make it sound like the praise is actually covering over something that is bad. So if you say that someone is a free thinker, Maybe that sounds a little too euphemistic if we don't give a lot of detail, because it sounds like maybe you're trying to apologize for some of the things that they thought and saying, oh, yeah, they were really free. Don't know if they were really right, something like that. Or go back to our very blunt grandmother. If we only said, oh, wow, she was perfectly honest, as an ironic lead into that joke, that might be funny. But if that were really the praise, it might make people uncomfortable because they would recognize that her honesty wasn't always a virtue. So those are some of the things that you might consider when you're trying to give compliments or speeches of praise. One way I think that's really a good way to practice giving compliments or giving praise is to try to praise a person that you love who is much older than you. And if you're in my class and you're coming to this video because you're doing this speech, this is exactly why we're doing this speech. It's something to help you practice praise, but thinking about it from a perspective which forces you to not fall into cliche. Often when we're thinking about people that are older than us, we might think about nice predicates or qualities of them that many old people share. We say that they're kind, they're generous, they're warm, they're wise. But all of those predicates by themselves don't really give us an image of the person. So what we want to do is find a way to praise that person using some of the techniques that I just talked about that gives your audience a vivid image of who that person is that you love. So that doesn't mean talking about how they were when they were younger. It has to be the person as you know them, which is not going to be when they were young because they're older than you. So if you can do that, you're going to be well equipped to praise people in lots of different situations.